Night before my mother-in-law's retirement gala, my husband's assistant called me from a number I didn't recognize. She said very quietly, "Don't come through the front entrance tomorrow. Park on Lakeshore, walk in through the side, and stay near the back hallway before the program starts. You need to hear something first." I almost hung up. My name is Vivienne. I'm 31 years old, and for the past 6 years I have been the person who quietly holds things together. At work, I'm a contracts manager at a mid-sized construction firm in Hamilton. At home, I'm the daughter-in-law who learned early that in my husband's family, competence is borrowed and credit is reassigned. I didn't know the assistant well. Her name was Fiona, and she'd been with my mother-in-law's property management company for 4 years. We had exchanged maybe 12 sentences total. So when she called me the night before the gala and asked me to do something that strange, I said, "Fiona, what's going on?" She paused. Then she said, "Just trust me. Come early." My husband was already asleep. I put my phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I went. I drove to the venue on Lakeshore Boulevard at 11 in the morning. The gala wasn't until 6. Fiona met me at the side entrance near the catering corridor, holding a coffee she bought for me without being asked. That detail mattered to me later. She handed it over without ceremony and said, "Follow me." She led me past the kitchen, through a narrow hallway lined with folding chairs, and stopped outside a partially open boardroom door. Inside, I could hear voices. My mother-in-law's voice, my husband's voice, and my brother-in-law, who had flown in from Calgary the night before and told me it was just for the party. I started to say something. Fiona put her hand up gently and shook her head. So I stood in a service hallway in a venue I had spent 3 months helping organize, holding a coffee I hadn't asked for, and I listened. My mother-in-law was speaking first. She has this particular register she uses when she's decided something and is simply informing people. Not asking. Informing. Tonight, before the board announcement, we finalized the transfer. I want it done before dessert. My husband said, "She'll be at the table. She won't know until it's public." My brother-in-law, whose name is Garrett, said, "And the consulting contract?" My mother-in-law said, "That gets voided automatically once the restructure is registered. She's not on the new entity." I knew who she was. Let me back up. 3 years ago, when my mother-in-law decided to expand her property management company into residential development, it was not going well. She had the properties but not the contracts expertise. My husband mentioned at dinner one evening that I worked in construction contracts. She called me the next morning, not to ask, to assign. I spent 8 months negotiating subcontractor agreements, reviewing site development permits, coordinating with the city of Hamilton on zoning variances. I did this after my regular job. I did this on weekends. I drove to Mississauga twice to meet with consultants she had already half committed to and needed someone to either finalize or cleanly exit. I didn't ask for payment. She was family. It was temporary. That's what I told myself. After the development launched, she offered me a formal consulting arrangement, a retainer. I signed it. I was proud of it. It felt like recognition. What I didn't read closely enough, because I trusted the people around me, was the clause that tied the retainer to the original numbered company. Not to the work, not to me, to the entity. If the entity restructured, the contract didn't transfer. It dissolved. And now I knew they were restructuring tonight, publicly, at a gala I had organized, at a venue I had negotiated a discounted rate for, because I knew the events coordinator from a previous job. My husband said, "She'll understand eventually. It's cleaner this way." Cleaner. I thought about the word for a moment, the way you think about something cold and sharp you just accidentally touched. Cleaner, as in, removing me was a sanitation decision. I was something to be tidied away. I looked at Fiona. She was watching me with an expression that wasn't pity. It was something closer to solidarity. She'd seen this before, I realized. She'd seen how this family operated, and she'd decided, quietly, on her own, that I should know. I walked back through the catering corridor and sat in my car for 45 minutes. I didn't cry right away. That surprised me. I thought I would. Instead, I felt something more like the moment before a storm when the air pressure changes and birds stop making noise. Everything went very still and very clear. I opened my phone and looked at the consulting contract I had saved in my Google Drive. I read it the way I should have read it 3 years ago, slowly, clause by clause. And there it was. Section 12, subsection C. In the event of corporate restructuring, the consulting arrangement shall remain binding on any successor entity that assumes 50% or more of the operational assets of the original company. Assumes 50% or more of the operational assets. I had written that clause, not in this contract. I had written a version of it 3 years ago for a completely different client, a general contractor in Burlington, who was terrified of being dropped mid-project if his developer restructured. I had used it so many times in my own work that it had become second nature. I didn't notice it here because I had submitted a version of my standard terms as part of the original agreement, and no one had pushed back on it. They had signed it. My mother-in-law's company had signed my standard terms, which included Section 12C, and no one had flagged it because no one on their side had read it carefully either. The successor entity assumption clause. If the new company took on the assets, the properties, the client relationships, it triggered my contract automatically. It didn't dissolve, it transferred. I sat in my car on Lakeshore Boulevard, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt something older and quieter than that. I thought about 6 years of Sunday dinners where I listened more than I spoke. I thought about the development project and the months of unpaid work before the retainer existed. I thought about my husband sleeping while I lay awake the night before this gala, holding the phone Fiona had called from. I thought about how they had planned to announce this at a party I had organized. I went home. I changed into the dress I'd bought in November for the occasion, a deep green wool crepe from a boutique in Westdale that I'd been saving for something that felt important. I did my makeup. I drove back to the venue. I walked in through the front entrance. The gala was beautiful. I had made sure of it. The florals were locally sourced through a supplier in Dundas. The catering was a Caribbean-Canadian fusion kitchen my mother-in-law had wanted specifically because her late husband had loved that food, and she wanted the evening to feel like him. I had found the caterer. I had negotiated the menu. I had confirmed the dietary restrictions for 47 guests. My mother-in-law greeted me at the entrance with both hands and said, "You look wonderful, sweetheart." I said, "Thank you. You deserve tonight." I meant it, actually. That was the complicated part. I wasn't pretending. I genuinely wanted the evening to be good for her. She had built something real. She had done hard things. The fact that she had also decided to cut me out of it didn't erase what she had built. It just clarified what I was to her. My husband found me near the bar and put his hand at the small of my back and said, "You look beautiful." Nervous? I said, "Not at all." He smiled. He didn't know what I knew. He thought the evening was already decided. Dinner proceeded. The speeches were warm. My brother-in-law gave a toast that made 3 people cry. My mother-in-law sat at the head table and looked like a woman, receiving something she had earned, which she had. At 8:45, the program coordinator took the microphone. She announced a special presentation. A screen at the front of the room illuminated corporate transition documents, a new company name, a new structure. My mother-in-law stood. She thanked the guests. She thanked her sons. She mentioned transition and legacy and the next chapter. My name was not spoken. My husband, from across the room, glanced at me once. I smiled at him. I raised my glass slightly. He looked relieved. That was his second mistake. The first was assuming I hadn't read my own contract. I did not make a scene. I stayed until the end. I hugged my mother-in-law. I said congratulations. I meant that too. I drove home. My husband stayed for the late portion with his brother. I sat at the kitchen table in Hamilton with my laptop open and my green dress still on, and I drafted one email. It was addressed to the legal contact listed on the new company's incorporation documents, which Fiona had photographed and sent to my phone at 7:30 that evening without me asking. She had just sent them. No message, just the images. I didn't send the email that night. I read it 4 times. Then I saved it to drafts and went to sleep. I slept better than I had in months. The following Monday, I sent the email. It was professional. It cited Section 12C. It outlined, without accusation, that my consulting contract contained a successor entity clause, and that based on the asset transfer disclosed at the Saturday Gala, the arrangement appeared to have transferred to the new company by operation of contract. I requested confirmation of the new company's intention to honor the terms. I copied my own lawyer, a contracts litigator I had worked with professionally named Brendan, who had agreed over the phone that morning to review the situation. My mother-in-law called me at 11:15. She did not use the warm voice. She used the other one. The one that had decided. She said, "What is this email?" I said, "It's a contract question." I thought it was best to address it formally. She said, "Vivienne, we can handle this as a family." I said, "I thought we were handling it as a family on Saturday night." I didn't seem to be part of that conversation. Silence. She said, "Garrett has already taken a position in the new structure. There's a role for you too if you want to be reasonable." A role. Not my contract. A role she was offering, contingent on being reasonable, which I understood to mean contingent on letting go of the legal question. I said, "I'll have Brendan review whatever you'd like to propose." She hung up. My husband came home early that afternoon. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where I was working and he said, "You're making this very difficult." I looked at him. I had loved this man. I had moved to Hamilton from Toronto, partly because his family was here. I had organized a gala for his mother. I had spent 8 months of evenings and weekends building contracts for a company that had just publicly removed me from its future without telling me. I said, "I'm not making it difficult. I'm making it documented." He said, "This isn't who you are." I said, "I think it is, actually. I think you just didn't expect it." He didn't have an answer for that. By Wednesday, Brendan had formally responded on my behalf. By Thursday, the new company's lawyer had contacted him directly. On Friday, my mother-in-law's accountant called Brendan to ask whether this could be resolved without filing. It could. That was always my preference. I had never wanted to file anything. I had wanted to be included, and when that stopped being possible, I wanted what I was owed. The number on the table by Friday afternoon was real. It wasn't a gesture. It was a proper settlement reflecting the value of the consulting work tied to the contract, including forward-looking fees for the project pipeline I had built relationships to support. My husband came home on Friday evening and sat down again in the same kitchen chair. He said, "You're actually going to take the money?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And then what?" I looked at him for a long time. I thought about Fiona standing in that hallway handing me a coffee, making a decision that cost her something because she thought I should know. I thought about the word cleaner. I thought about 8 months of Saturdays. I said, "I don't know yet, but I know I won't be organizing any more events I'm not invited to." The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday. I signed in Brendan's office in downtown Hamilton, a corner office with a view of the escarpment that I had always found quietly stabilizing. He walked me through each page. He was good at his job. When it was done, he shook my hand and said, "That was well handled." I thanked him. And then I said, "Can you give me Fiona's contact information? She works for the company. I'd like to send her something." He looked mildly puzzled but found the email in the correspondence chain and wrote it down for me. I sent Fiona a card. A real one. Paper. Not an email. I found a stationery shop on King Street, and I wrote it by hand. I told her I didn't know exactly what it cost her to make that call, but I hadn't forgotten it, and I wasn't going to. I included a gift card to a restaurant in the city she had mentioned once, months ago in passing, that she'd been wanting to try. She texted the number she'd called from that first night. She said, You didn't have to do that. I said, I know. That's why I did. My husband and I are separated now. It wasn't a dramatic decision. We didn't have a single defining conversation where everything broke. It was more like watching something that had already changed a long time ago finally become visible. Some things don't end. They just clarify. My mother-in-law sent a message through my sister-in-law in December. It said she was sorry things had become formal. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty. I just didn't have anything left to say that hadn't already been said in documents. I still live in Hamilton. I still work in contracts. I'm better at reading them than I've ever been, not because I'm more suspicious, but because I understand now that the details are where people reveal what they actually intend. The fine print tells you who someone is more honestly than any dinner table conversation ever will. Last month I took on a new client, small residential developer. First project, nervous about subcontractor agreements. She reminded me a little of who I was 3 years ago. I spent the first meeting just listening to what she was trying to build. I told her, before we get into any paperwork, you need to understand one thing. A contract is not a relationship, but a bad contract can end one. So we read everything, every clause, every subsection. We don't sign until we understand what we're agreeing to. She said, was there a specific reason you're telling me this first? I said yes, and I smiled and didn't explain further. I don't fund other people's legacies anymore. I build my own.